She hadn't spoken a single word in days. Not to the sheriff, not to the nurses, not even to her own family. But when she leaned in and whispered into the soldier's dog's ear, he ran. And what he led them to, left the entire town speechless. The fog along Highway 16 drifted low and slow like breath from the earth, curling around fence posts and telephone poles. It was just past 6 a.m., and the only vehicle on the road was an old F-150 rattling toward the southern ridge, radio humming softly with static-ridden country blues. Jake Elmore sipped black coffee from his thermos as he steered around a curve. He was a man of habits, early riser, part-time mechanic, and part-time caretaker at the Red River Veteran Shelter just a few miles out. That morning had started like any other, until he saw her. She appeared on the road's shoulder like an apparition. A little girl. Barefoot. Thin. Nightgown stained with mud and torn at the hem. She was walking, drifting, forward, arms loosely at her sides, face pale as the sky. Jake hit the brakes hard. The truck groaned to a halt 30 feet ahead of her. He jumped out, boots crunching gravel. Hey! Hey, sweetheart, you okay? The girl didn't stop. Didn't run. Just kept walking, eyes forward, distant. Jake took a few careful steps toward her. My name's Jake. I'm not gonna hurt you. You need help? Nothing. No eye contact. No sound. Jake crouched slowly, palms raised. Are you lost? Are your folks nearby? Still nothing. The girl finally stopped walking, but she didn't look at him. She stared past him, through him, as if watching something he couldn't see. Then her legs buckled. Jake darted forward and caught her just before she hit the gravel. She was cold, clammy, like she'd spent the night outdoors. Her feet were torn and raw, her knuckles scraped, and there was a thin bruise just beneath her jaw. He lifted her gently and carried her to the truck. All right, baby girl, he whispered, wrapping his flannel jacket around her shoulders. We're gonna get you warm. We're gonna get you safe. 10 minutes later, Jake pulled into the Red River Clinic in town. Nurse May Caldwell rushed out with a stretcher, flanked by Dr. Elsie Hartwell, who immediately began checking vitals. Sheriff Andy Dalton was notified within minutes. They laid the girl on a padded table, wrapped her in heated blankets, and gave her warm fluids through a straw. She didn't resist, but she didn't speak either. Not a word. No ID. No name sewn into the gown. Nothing in her pockets. She sat silently, staring at a blank corner of the examination room, eyes glassy. She's in shock, Dr. Hartwell said. Could be trauma, dissociation, or something deeper. Sheriff Dalton crouched beside her. You're safe now, honey. Nobody's gonna hurt you. Can you tell us your name? The girl blinked once. Then twice. But her lips never moved. Dalton stood. We need to check for any missing persons alerts, statewide. Jake paced nearby. You think someone dumped her? Dalton sighed. Or worse. News spread fast in Red River. By lunchtime, half the town had heard about the girl from the highway. A few claimed to have seen her face before, others speculated she was from the reservation lands out east. But no one could say for sure. By 4 p.m., child services had arrived. They tried soft voices, toys, even a therapy bear, but nothing broke through. She didn't cry. Didn't flinch. She simply sat still, quiet as stone. She's like a ghost, one nurse whispered. That's when Jake had a thought. I got someone she might talk to, he said. Someone who doesn't use words, either. 30 minutes later, Jake returned to the clinic with a large German Shepherd riding in the back of his truck. The dog's name was Ranger. A retired military canine from Afghanistan, Ranger had served 3 tours with the 71st Infantry until a roadside blast took the life of his handler and left the dog with a wounded hip. Jake had adopted him 2 years ago through the Veteran Shelter's rehabilitation program. Ranger was a giant, 95 pounds of muscle and discipline, with intelligent amber eyes and a solemn calm. He rarely barked, never begged, and didn't respond to strangers. But Jake knew the way Ranger responded to pain. He felt it. He absorbed it. The moment they stepped inside the clinic, the girl's posture shifted. Not much. Just a tilt of her head. Her gaze drifted from the corner to the door where Ranger stood. Jake led the dog in slowly. "This here's Ranger," he said softly. "He's seen some things. Heard things no kid should ever have to. Maybe he understands you better than we can." No response from the girl. But her eyes, wide now, followed every step Ranger took. Jake unhooked the leash and let the dog walk. Ranger sniffed the room, slow and cautious. Then he approached the exam table. He didn't jump. Didn't bark. He sat. And looked up at her. The girl blinked. Her hands twitched. Then, for the first time, she moved. She slipped from the table, crouched, and knelt in front of Ranger. Everyone watched. And then she did something no one expected. She leaned forward, pressed her lips to Ranger's ear. And whispered. A single, soft phrase. Unheard by anyone in the room. Ranger's ears perked. His eyes widened. Then, without waiting for command, he turned and bolted through the clinic doors. Straight into the woods. Jake screamed, "Ranger!" But the dog was gone. The girl? She just sat back down. Silent once again. Sheriff Andy Dalton had seen his share of strange things in Red River, elk wandering into backyards, kids claiming ghost stories on foggy nights, but nothing like this. A silent girl who only spoke to a dog. A whisper that sent a retired canine running into the woods like a bullet. And now, here he was, flashlight in one hand, sidearm on his hip, trying to keep pace with Jake Elmore through the dense forest beyond Highway 16. "Do you see him?" Dalton called ahead. Jake, breathing hard, scanned the trees. "No, but he knows where he's going. He's tracking." How the hell could he know what she said? Jake didn't answer. The truth was, he didn't know. He'd seen Ranger respond to trauma before. React to subtle cues. But this was different. The dog wasn't moving on instinct. He was following something specific. Something real. They reached a clearing where the trees bent inward like a natural cathedral. And there, at the center, paw prints. Jake knelt and touched the soft earth. Fresh. He was just here. Dalton caught his breath, eyes flicking around. "You sure this is smart?" Jake looked up. "Sheriff, you didn't see her face when she whispered. That wasn't random. That girl knew something. And Ranger, he's the only one she trusts." Dalton exhaled and nodded. "All right. Let's keep going." Back at the clinic, the girl hadn't moved. She sat on the examination table, legs swinging slowly, hands folded in her lap. When asked questions, she offered nothing. Not a word, not a blink of recognition. Dr. Hartwell entered quietly. She's stable, physically. But emotionally? She's somewhere else. Laura, a volunteer from Child Services, kneeled beside her with a soft expression. "Sweetheart, can you tell us what you said to the dog?" The girl turned her head slightly. But still, silence. Laura sighed and stood. "She's not ready." But Nurse May noticed something. The girl wasn't staring into the void anymore. She was staring at the forest outside. Watching. Waiting. Ranger moved like a phantom through the woods, body low, tail straight, ears forward. He darted through brush, avoided low branches, and never once looked back. He passed an old wooden fence, half collapsed, and crossed a dry stream bed. Then he stopped. He sniffed the air, barked once, then veered left toward a slope marked with wild sage. Minutes later, Jake and Dalton arrived at the same stream bed. The underbrush was dense, the path barely visible. But Ranger's trail was clear, prints pressed deep into the moist soil. Jake's heart thudded with every step. What is he looking for? Dalton unsnapped his holster. Let's hope it's not a body. They climbed the slope, boots sliding on wet leaves. At the crest, they found something. A shoe. Tiny. Muddy. Child size. Jake picked it up, his stomach turning. Dalton raised his radio. Dispatch, this is Dalton. We've got evidence of a possible secondary location. Send a search unit to Sector 7, northeast quadrant of Ridgeback Woods. Coordinates incoming. Back at the clinic, the girl stirred. She stood up, quietly, and walked to the window. Laura approached gently. Do you see something? The girl placed her hand against the glass. And whispered, he found it. Meanwhile, Ranger reached a small ravine bordered by a cluster of collapsed wooden beams. A fallen shed, old and forgotten. He circled once, sniffed intensely, and then barked, loud and sharp. Jake and Dalton reached him seconds later. Jake pointed. Over there. Dalton moved fast, pushing debris aside. That's when they saw it. A cellar door. Rusty. Buried beneath ivy and broken planks. Dalton yanked it open. A metallic creak echoed into the earth. Inside, darkness. Jake pulled his flashlight and shined it downward. Stone steps. Dirt walls. At the bottom, something moved. Dalton descended carefully, gun drawn. The flashlight beam flicked across the space. Sleeping bag. Cans. Children's toys. A worn stuffed rabbit. And in the corner, scratched into the wall, a name. Sophie. Dalton called up. Get me back up. And call child protection. We've got a site. Jake stepped back, stunned. That's her name. They returned to the clinic an hour later. When Jake walked in, Ranger at his side, the girl stood without being prompted. She looked at the dog. And smiled. A single tear rolled down her cheek. Jake knelt beside her. Is your name Sophie? She nodded. Softly. Slowly. Then she reached out and hugged Ranger tightly. And for the first time since she was found. She whispered again. The cellar was colder than it should have been. Sheriff Dalton and Jake stood in its tight confines, the only sounds their boots shifting on dirt and the soft buzz of the flashlight beam flickering off rusted tools. Time had passed in this space, but nothing had healed. The air felt like it hadn't moved in years. The name Sophie scratched into the stone wall was crude but intentional. It wasn't random graffiti, it was carved with desperate fingers. The edges of the letters were jagged, clawed into the limestone, not drawn. Dalton crouched beside the sleeping bag and turned over a can. Expired ravioli. How long you think she was down here? Jake asked, his voice tight. Dalton's jaw clenched. Too long. Someone brought her supplies. But it's been at least a week, maybe more. Jake glanced at the doorway. Someone had to know she was missing. Where are her parents? Dalton didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence told Jake everything, no missing persons alert. No media coverage. No APBs. Sophie had vanished, and no one had raised the alarm. That was impossible. Or, it was intentional. Back at the clinic, Sophie curled up on a cot with Ranger lying protectively beside her. Laura sat close, notebook in hand, watching. Sophie still hadn't spoken to any adult. Only to Ranger. She would occasionally whisper in his ear, then rest her forehead against his. Ranger would then look toward Laura or the nurse. Sometimes bark. Sometimes just stare. It was uncanny. "Can you tell me what she said?" Laura asked softly. Ranger, of course, said nothing. But Sophie smiled faintly and hugged the dog tighter. Laura sighed. "You're his translator, aren't you?" The girl gave a tiny nod. And then, in the quietest voice Laura had ever heard, she spoke. "He remembers." Dalton returned to the clinic that afternoon, hair damp with sweat, expression worn thin. He motioned Laura into the hallway. "She said her name was Sophie," he asked. Laura nodded. "Just once. After Ranger found the cellar." Dalton took a long breath. "I called in some favors. Checked missing child databases. There's no recent entry for a Sophie that matches her description. Not locally. Not statewide. But I found something else." He pulled out a faded report, printed from an old archive. Sophie Randall. 8 years old. Reported missing in 2017. Upstate Oregon. Disappeared after a car accident. Parents died in the crash. She was presumed dead, though the body was never recovered. Laura's eyes widened. "That's 8 years ago." Dalton nodded. "Same age. Same face. It's like she didn't age a day." "That's not possible." "No, it isn't. But neither is a dog understanding whispered words from a child he's never met." Jake was outside the clinic, brushing down Ranger with a cloth, whispering thanks into his fur. "You found her, bud." "I don't know how, but you did." Ranger looked up suddenly, ears erect. "What is it?" The dog stood and padded to the end of the gravel path, sniffing the air. Then he growled. Deep. Low. Jake followed his gaze. At the edge of the tree line across the road, a dark figure watched them. Too far to see clearly. Dressed in all black. Unmoving. Jake's stomach dropped. "Hey!" He called out, but the figure turned and disappeared into the woods. Jake ran to the edge, but the person was gone. He returned, uneasy. "They were watching," he muttered. "Someone knew she was here." Ranger remained stiff, tail low, scanning the horizon. Whatever he sensed, it wasn't over. Dalton reviewed the original case files from 2017. Sophie Randall. Vehicle accident on Route 32. Parents both declared deceased. Sophie's seat was empty upon rescue. Initial theory was she had wandered off in shock, but blood on the glass suggested she'd been hurt. Search parties scoured the area for 2 weeks. Nothing. Then a quiet note in the file, lead withdrawn. Family burial approved. Case closed. Dalton highlighted the words and circled one phrase that stood out. Custodial release declined. "What the hell does that mean?" he muttered. That night, Jake couldn't sleep. He left Ranger curled up on the porch and went into his workshop, pulling out the old dog tags he kept from the shelter records. Each dog adopted through Red River Veteran Shelter had a paper trail. He checked Ranger's. Handler, Lieutenant Mark Randall. Jake froze. "Randall?" He checked the adoption paperwork. Lieutenant Randall's unit was disbanded after a helicopter crash overseas. Kia, presumed dead. But he had one next of kin listed in the record. Sophie Randall. Daughter. Jake dropped the papers. Oh my God. At the clinic, Sophie sat with Ranger again. She traced the dog's name tag with her tiny fingers. "That's my daddy's," she whispered. Laura blinked. "Your daddy's?" Sophie nodded, eyes glassy. They said he was gone. But Ranger remembered. So I knew. Knew what? That he sent Ranger to find me. Jake stormed into Dalton's office at sunrise, papers in hand. She's his kid. Lieutenant Mark Randall. Ranger's old handler. Dalton looked up, shocked. How did we miss that? They changed her last name in the system. Her case was closed before it even started. Dalton leaned back, hands behind his head. They didn't lose her. They hid her, Jake said. Or someone did. But why? Jake's voice dropped. Because Lieutenant Randall was no ordinary soldier. His files half classified. He was part of black site extraction units. Dalton stood. You're saying Sophie wasn't in that crash by accident? I'm saying she was taken. And Ranger? He was never supposed to find her. But he had. Because he remembered her scent. Because no matter how far they buried the truth, the soldier's dog never forgot his final order. Somewhere deep in the archives of forgotten battlefields and redacted reports, the truth about Lieutenant Mark Randall was still buried. But Jake and Dalton had begun to unearth the pieces, enough to see that Sophie's story wasn't just about a lost child. It was about a mission left unfinished, a soldier's final order, and a dog who never gave up. Jake sat at the counter of his garage-turned office, scanning the microfiche reels that Dalton had acquired from an old contact in the Pentagon. The records were spotty. Dozens of blacked-out paragraphs. But one detail emerged again and again. Lieutenant Randall was part of a recovery unit tasked with protecting civilian informants, especially children, during post-strike evacuations. And Ranger had been his partner. One document, filed only days before Randall's death, mentioned a classified directive. Operation Sparrow Nest, subject classified juvenile, non-hostile, elevated intelligence status. Extraction recommended under full discretion. Handler, Randall. Jake leaned back, stunned. Sophie wasn't just his daughter. She was on the mission manifest. Dalton cross-referenced everything they had. We need to be careful. If this operation was black tier, someone will be watching. Jake pointed to the name tags. It wasn't just about keeping her safe. He trusted Ranger. That was his last command. Dalton stood, his expression grave. Then someone disobeyed it. And tried to erase it. Back at the clinic, Sophie was beginning to open up, but only to Ranger. Laura watched as the girl knelt beside the dog and whispered again. Ranger blinked, tilted his head, and stood. He walked slowly to the corner of the room and pawed at a closet door. Laura opened it, revealing a box of old medical supplies. Sophie walked over and pulled out a small package hidden behind the box. It was a memory card. Plastic. Dusty. Weathered. Sophie held it gently and whispered, "He told me to hide it." The town library had the only clean room with an unfiltered reader system. Dalton cleared it out. Laura, Jake, and Sophie sat in silence as the files loaded. Video files. Audio logs. GPS trails. One video started playing, grainy footage of Lieutenant Randall kneeling beside Sophie in a dim room lit only by a flickering lamp. "Sparrow, you listening?" Randall said, calling Sophie by her codename. She nodded. "If anything happens, you stick with Ranger. He's not just a dog, baby. He's your lifeline. If I don't come back, you whisper. He'll know. And he'll find the rest." Sophie sniffled. "Where are you going?" Randall smiled sadly. "To make sure they don't take you again." The footage cut out. Laura was speechless. This wasn't just a father and daughter. This was a cover operation. Dalton's phone buzzed. A restricted number. He answered. A disguised voice spoke, "You've been flagged. Cease all investigation into subject Sparrow Nest. This is your only warning." The line went dead. Dalton looked at the others. "They know we know." Jake clenched his fists. "Let them come." That night, Sophie stayed at Jake's place, with Ranger curled around her like a living wall. She finally began to speak, softly, slowly. "They kept me underground after Daddy left. Said I had something important in me. That I wasn't like other kids." Jake sat on the floor beside her. "Do you remember where?" "Lots of noise. Lights. Doctors. Were they mean to you?" "Some. But not all. One lady helped me sneak Ranger out." Jake frowned. "You mean he got to you?" Sophie nodded. "When they said Daddy was gone, I whispered to Ranger. Told him to find help." Jake's voice cracked. "And he came to me." Sophie smiled faintly. "Because he remembered." Dalton called in backup, a few retired friends from his days in federal service. Red River wasn't big enough to hold what was coming. Laura prepared press packages. The footage from the memory card was burned to disks, uploaded to offshore servers, and printed. They weren't just protecting Sophie now. They were protecting history. And truth. 3 nights later, Jake returned from a grocery run and noticed his front door ajar. He froze. Ranger, who had stayed with Sophie, was pacing at the window, growling. Jake slowly entered, his hand on his holster. "Sophie," he called. No answer. He stepped deeper. A whisper came from the hallway. "She's gone." Ranger barked sharply. The living room was torn apart, drawers open, papers scattered. On the kitchen table, a manila envelope. Inside, a photograph. Sophie, blindfolded, held between 2 men in suits. And one note. "Call off the dog. Or she disappears for good." Jake's fingers trembled as he stared at the photo on his kitchen table. Sophie, blindfolded, lips slightly parted, her small shoulders trembling, was being held by 2 men who looked like shadows given form. The image was recent. He could feel it. The edge of her sleeve had the same tear he'd seen just hours before. Dalton picked up the photo with gloved hands and turned it over. Nothing. No text. No markings. But Jake had seen something else. In the upper corner, a faint reflection in the glass behind Sophie. An old sign, partially blocked, "I see Waro." Jake stood up suddenly. "Public warehouse." Dalton blinked. "What?" "Old distribution depot. Edge of town. Been closed for 10 years. Dalton's face darkened. "That's where they've got her." Within the hour, Jake, Dalton, and Ranger had geared up. Laura stayed behind to monitor the radio frequency and coordinate with backup. The evidence was ready to go viral if anything happened to them. Ranger sniffed the photograph, then circled the porch twice before sprinting into the brush behind Jake's house. Jake ran after him. "He knows the scent. He's going to lead us." Dalton followed, checking the pistol strapped beneath his jacket. "Let's just hope they haven't moved her." The compound sat at the far edge of the industrial district, a rusting behemoth of twisted fences, collapsed roofing, and cracked pavement. Once a bustling logistics hub, now just another forgotten ruin. But tonight, it wasn't empty. 3 unmarked black SUVs sat outside the loading dock. Faint cigarette smoke drifted from the open driver's side window of one. Ranger stopped just short of the perimeter, lying low in the grass. Jake crouched beside him, pulling out binoculars. "Security," he whispered. 2 posted at the east gate. 1 walking patrol on the roof. Dalton pulled a map from his jacket. "There's a storm drain near the rear side. Old maintenance shaft. I used to fish near here as a kid. Jake raised an eyebrow. That's oddly convenient. Dalton smirked. Don't knock nostalgia. They entered the shaft quietly, Ranger taking the lead. The tunnel stank of rust and wet rot, but it led them beneath the building. After 300 yards, they reached a rusted service grate. Jake peered through. A storage room. Dimly lit. 2 figures stood near a cot. Sophie. She sat with her knees drawn to her chest, blindfold still in place, hands zip-tied in front of her. Jake's heart punched his ribs. She's alive, he whispered. Dalton nodded grimly. 2 guards. But we don't know who else is here. Jake turned to Ranger. Track, buddy. Go quiet. The dog nodded. Literally nodded. Then crept into the shadows like a whisper. What followed felt like a scene from an elite operation. Ranger moved first, emerging from the darkness with such fluid grace that the 2 guards didn't notice until it was far too late. He hit the first one low, sending him tumbling into the wall with a thud. Jake was through the door in seconds, Dalton behind him. The second guard raised a gun, Dalton fired once. The man crumpled. Jake raced to Sophie, pulling off the blindfold. Her eyes were wide with shock, then recognition. Jake, she whispered, voice breaking. You're okay now. You're safe. Ranger licked her cheek once, gently. Jake cut the zip ties and lifted her into his arms. We're getting you out. But it wasn't over yet. A voice crackled over the old speaker system. Well done, Mr. Elmore. You really are predictable. The lights snapped on, bright and blinding. Steel doors slammed shut across the compound. A cold, amused voice echoed through the warehouse. You brought the dog. Good. That means we're nearly done here. Dalton shouted, Who are you? You can call me Cleanup, the voice replied. Your girl has information she shouldn't. And the dog is a liability. Jake looked down at Sophie. What does he mean? She looked up, eyes full of fear. They think I have Daddy's key. Jake frowned. What key? Before she could answer, gunfire erupted from the far end of the warehouse. Jake dove behind a forklift, shielding Sophie. Ranger flanked right, disappearing behind crates. Dalton returned fire. They've got at least 5 more coming in. Jake grit his teeth. We make a run for the south stairwell. There's a fire exit. Too far, Dalton said. We need a distraction. Ranger barked from the far end. Loud. Persistent. Guess that's our cue, Jake said. Ranger ran a perfect circuit through the opposite side of the warehouse, drawing fire with each bark. He moved like smoke, darting, flanking, vanishing. Dalton provided cover while Jake ran with Sophie cradled in his arms. Gunshots cracked, wood splintered. Ranger yelped. Jake stopped cold. No. Then the dog emerged from the side, limping slightly, but still pushing forward. He wasn't giving up. Neither were they. They reached the stairwell. Jake slammed the exit bar and burst into the alley. 2 black SUVs were there, but empty. Laura's voice buzzed through the comms. I'm tracking you. Backup is inbound. 10 minutes. Jake ran to the far fence, boosting Sophie up and over. Ranger jumped. Despite his injured leg, he cleared it. Dalton followed last, holding his side, bleeding. A bullet had grazed him. But they didn't stop. Not until the flashing lights of local PD lit up the road and sirens howled. Jake collapsed on the pavement, Sophie still in his arms. Ranger laid beside them, panting heavily. They'd made it. But just barely. The agents were gone by the time authorities stormed the compound. No sign of their leader. No records. No fingerprints. But Jake didn't care. Sophie was alive. And Ranger? He'd done what no person could. He had followed an order no one else had ever heard. And he had brought her home. The Red River Sheriff's Office had never felt so heavy. Not even during flood season, or the standoff back in '03. Tonight, it felt like the entire weight of silence, war, and forgotten orders hung in the stale air. Sophie sat in the corner of the room, wrapped in a thermal blanket, Ranger's head resting gently in her lap. Her eyes were open now, truly open. Clear. Focused. The trauma still lingered, but a quiet fire had returned. The same spark Jake had seen when she whispered to Ranger for the first time. Dalton's arm was stitched and wrapped, and he paced across the room, watching Laura connect the pendant Sophie had worn on a chain around her neck to a secure laptop. "You're sure that's the key?" he asked. Laura nodded. "Not a key in the traditional sense. It's a microdrive, encrypted. Custom format. Whoever gave it to her didn't want it found." Jake looked to Sophie. "Did your dad give you that?" She nodded. "When?" Sophie took a deep breath. "The night before he left. He said it had to stay hidden. That if the people chasing us found it, they'd never stop." Dalton muttered under his breath, "They didn't." The drive decrypted slowly. First, a black screen. Then a command prompt. Laura typed. "Access equals Randall.perimeter." A soft ping. Then files began to appear. Dozens. Hundreds. Videos. Audio logs. Mission reports. Satellite imagery. Operation Sparrow Nest wasn't just about extraction. It was about exposure. And Sophie hadn't been just cargo. She had been a protected witness. Her father had uncovered a covert trafficking pipeline, a black-tier military contractor that had diverted operations in war zones to smuggle high-value human assets to untraceable facilities. Sophie had witnessed the killing of one such informant, a young girl her age, by American personnel. Randall had filed the evidence to internal command. He was warned. Then his helicopter went down. They said it was an accident. The pendant contained everything. Dalton leaned over the laptop. "This is enough to bury 10 careers. Maybe more." Laura added, "This is evidence of war crimes. Civilian executions. Covert manipulation of evacuation corridors." Jake just stared at the screen. He trusted her with this. Because he knew he wasn't coming back. Sophie looked up. And Ranger. He knew he'd protect it too. The room went silent. News agencies were already sniffing around after the compound shootout. There were rumors online. Hashtags trending. Whispers about a government raid gone wrong. Dalton reached out to Naomi's old network, the encrypted whistleblower grid. A digital upload package was prepared. Multiple mirrors. If the file hit the net, there would be no hiding it. But they knew the risk. "You do this," Dalton warned, "and they'll come harder. Not just for Sophie. For all of us." Jake stepped forward. "Then we give them no time to regroup." He placed the final USB in Laura's hand. "Upload it all. Tonight." While the files began syncing the global servers, Jake took Sophie and Ranger to the back porch of the sheriff's station. The stars above were sharp and cold. Sophie looked up. "Will they come again?" Jake nodded slowly. "They might." Sophie pet Ranger's ears. "But we'll be ready, right?" Jake gave a sad smile. "We'll always be ready." Sophie turned her head and looked directly into his eyes. "Daddy said Ranger wouldn't stop until I was safe. You are now." "No," she whispered. "Not yet." Jake's stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" He told me there was one more. One who helped. Jake frowned. One who helped you. She nodded. A woman. A soldier. She smuggled me out before they moved me underground. Daddy said if we ever escaped, we had to find her. She knew everything too. She knew the second safe house. Dalton emerged from the doorway behind them. Her name? Sophie hesitated. Savannah. Laura found her in the files. Captain Savannah Ortiz. Decorated Special Forces operator. Medically discharged after a training accident in 2019. Last known address, a ranch 40 miles outside Boise, Idaho. Jake paced. If she's still alive, we need to reach her. Dalton looked down at Ranger. Think he can find her? Jake smiled grimly. He hasn't let us down yet. Plans move fast. Dalton coordinated with 2 retired U.S. Marshals who still owed him favors. A safe house was prepped in Idaho. A quiet RV was rented under a false name. Jake, Sophie, and Ranger would go. No convoys. No police escort. Just ghosts carrying the truth across invisible lines. Laura burned the final disc and slid it into a tiny envelope marked "If We Fall." She handed it to Dalton. He swallowed. I'll keep it close. Before dawn, the RV rolled quietly out of Red River. Jake drove. Sophie lay curled up in the back bunk, Ranger lying at her side. In his paw, she had placed the tag again, Randall's old one. She whispered one last phrase before drifting off. Lead us to her, Ranger. Just like you did for me. Ranger closed his eyes. But he wasn't asleep. He was listening. And remembering. Because the mission wasn't done. Not yet.
The drive through Idaho's backroads had been long and silent. Jake didn't speak much. Neither did Sophie. The landscape rolled by in shades of gray and gold as the sun cut low across the mountains. Ranger sat stiffly by the window, watching every sign, sniffing at every stop, his posture straight with memory and mission. They were heading north, past Boise's edge, toward the last known residence of Captain Savannah Ortiz. The name alone felt like the hinge on a locked door. Everything, Randall's secret, Sophie's imprisonment, the cover-up, seemed to point toward her. And, according to the encrypted file in Sophie's pendant, Savannah had vanished 2 years ago. Not disappeared like a civilian, vanished like a ghost. They arrived at the ranch just before sunrise. It was nestled at the edge of a ridgeline, flanked by pine forests and shadowed cliffs. From the outside, it looked abandoned, overgrown driveway, rusting mailbox, and shutters hanging loose on one window. Jake stopped the RV about 200 feet from the house. Ranger was already at the door, tail rigid, ears forward. You smell her? Jake asked. Ranger whined softly, then barked, once short and certain. She was here. Jake approached cautiously, holding Sophie's hand. He raised his voice. Savannah Ortiz. Name's Jake Elmore. I have someone you know. No response. I'm not law enforcement. I'm not here to hurt you. We have Randall's daughter. Still nothing. Then, the creak of a porch step. A woman emerged from the side of the house. She was lean, sunburned, and carried the stance of someone who had seen too much to ever relax. Her left shoulder had a visible scar peeking from under her rolled-up flannel. Her eyes were sharp, and her right hand hovered near her hip, not on a gun, but close. She stared at Sophie, then at Ranger, then back to Jake. You brought them here, she said, not a question, but an accusation. Jake nodded. You're the only one who can fill in the rest. Savannah stepped down the porch step slowly. She stopped 5 feet from Ranger, knelt, and held out her hand. Ranger sniffed. Then, in a rare moment of softness, he leaned into her palm and whined. Savannah's eyes misted. Good boy, she whispered. You made it. Inside, the ranch house was Spartan but secure, every window reinforced, backup generator humming in the garage. Savannah poured Jake a mug of black coffee and sat at the table with her hands folded. Sophie curled up with Ranger on the floor beside his space heater. Jake didn't waste time. We have the files. Randall's final upload. We've sent them out already. But we need context. Names. Places. Your role. Savannah's jaw tightened. My role was to get the kid out. She said you helped her escape. I did. Why didn't you come forward? Because Randall was dead. And I was burned. Jake waited. She leaned back and began. I was with Randall in 2017. Assigned to Shadow Operative Task Group 9, embedded within Afghanistan's southern corridor. We weren't just military. We were intel gatherers. Off the books. Our job was to extract and process civilian informants. But somewhere along the line, things changed. How? They started redirecting our missions. Evacuation routes were rerouted. We'd arrive late to find villages empty or destroyed. At first, we thought it was Taliban interference. But Randall figured out the truth. What truth? They weren't saving civilians. They were collecting specific ones, children with memory of certain ops. Kids who had seen too much or overheard the wrong thing. Sophie was one of them. Jake frowned. But she was Randall's daughter. Exactly. And that made her dangerous. Savannah's voice dropped. Randall found out she'd been flagged for removal. Someone in command saw her as a threat to operational integrity. So Randall ran. He faked the crash? No. The crash was real. But he knew it was coming. That's why he prepped Ranger. That's why he gave Sophie the pendant. And that's why he gave me a second order. Jake leaned in. Which was? If they caught her again, I was to disappear. And wait. The files had confirmed what Savannah said, a hidden network of Black Ops missions repurposed for covert population control. Not war against enemies, but against inconvenient witnesses. Even children. Jake pulled out the photo of Sophie blindfolded from the compound. Do you recognize these men? Savannah studied the image, then nodded grimly. Private intel contractors. Former federal assets turned freelancers. They work for anyone who'll pay to make people disappear quietly. They'll come again, Jake said. They always do. That night, Jake, Savannah, and Sophie sat by the fire in the ranch's main room. Sophie looked up at Savannah. Did my daddy trust you? Savannah didn't hesitate. With my life. Then I do too. Savannah smiled faintly. Then Sophie turned to Jake. Do I have to run forever? Jake looked at Ranger, then back at her. No. We'll protect you, Savannah added. Sophie's voice dropped to a whisper. Even if they come? Jake stood, walked to the front window, and looked out over the dark woods. He spoke without turning. If they come, they'll find out that the only thing more dangerous than a soldier, he glanced at Ranger, is a soldier's dog.
The world didn't explode the day the files dropped. But it cracked. At 8:02 a.m., the first mirrored release of Operation Sparrow Nest went live on a Swiss-based server. Within 30 minutes, it had been mirrored to 10 more. By noon, every major news outlet across the US and Europe had caught wind of the leak. A whistleblower had come forward, a war dog handler's daughter, held in silence, rescued from a covert facility. It was a headline that couldn't be ignored. What stunned everyone wasn't just the accusations of human trafficking, black site intelligence corruption, or unauthorized wartime cover-ups. It was the proof. Video files. Names. Coordinates. Audio of mission briefings and after-action reports. But most damning of all, the footage of Lieutenant Mark Randall. This mission violates everything I swore to protect. I will not let my daughter become a weapon in someone else's war. The clip went viral in under an hour. By sunset, the Idaho ranch was surrounded, not by enemies, but by journalists and supporters. Satellite vans lined the road. Military veterans in worn fatigues stood watch beside local police, creating a protective ring. Sophie stayed inside. Too much noise. Too many people. Ranger stayed with her, never more than a foot away. Jake stood beside Savannah at the edge of the porch, sipping bitter coffee and watching the storm roll in, not a storm of nature, but of reckoning. They didn't think anyone would talk, Savannah said. Jake nodded. They didn't think a dog would remember. 3 days later, an emergency Senate inquiry launched. 2 former generals resigned. 1 high-ranking defense contractor was arrested while boarding a flight to Dubai. The director of a private security firm cited in the documents issued a flat denial, but reporters camped outside his home until his statement began to unravel. Savannah's testimony was requested by a special human rights panel. Dalton delivered a physical hard drive in person. But no one asked Sophie to speak. They didn't need to. She had already said everything, through the eyes of the dog who never left her side. On the 4th day, Sophie spoke to the world. Not on a stage. Not in a courtroom. But in a short video Laura filmed in a quiet corner of the ranch. Sophie sat on the floor with Ranger curled beside her, a soft wool blanket over her knees. Her voice trembled, but her words were clear. My dad wasn't a bad man. He didn't run away. He tried to protect people like me. I saw things. I didn't understand all of it, but I remember. And so does Ranger. He found me when no one else could. The video ended with one final phrase. Ranger never forgot what my dad asked him to do. And now, neither will the world. The clip reached 10 million views in its first day. A week later, Ranger received the Service Cross for Valor, the first ever awarded to a retired canine. The ceremony was held at a secure compound in Oregon. Jake stood beside him, a new dog tag around Ranger's neck with Randall's name etched into steel. Sophie placed the medal around his neck herself. And when she hugged him after, he didn't move, not even an inch. He just stared forward, ears up, guarding her still. But not everyone celebrated. Protests broke out in D.C., New York, Atlanta, people furious about the corruption, about the lies, about the silence that let a child disappear without consequence. At the Red River Sheriff's Office, Dalton returned to his desk with a letter of commendation and a quiet warning. You made enemies, it read. But you made history too. Savannah declined further interviews. She said her part had been said. Jake kept the ranch running, repairing the old truck, splitting firewood, rebuilding the barn doors. Sophie stayed with him. They set up a homeschool program with the help of a local teacher, but more importantly, they set up a small training course in the backyard, for Ranger. Not to prepare for war. To play. One crisp fall morning, a letter arrived addressed to Sophie. It came from the Department of Veterans Affairs. Inside was a certificate. For service rendered in the preservation of truth, we recognize you as an honorary civilian protector of the peace. Sophie smiled, tucked the certificate into a photo frame with her father's picture, and hung it over her bed. But what mattered more to her was the new dog tag she had made. It said simply, "To Ranger, for never forgetting who I am." That evening, Jake, Savannah, and Sophie sat under the stars. A fire crackled gently between them. Ranger snored lightly nearby, his ears twitching with dreams. Savannah spoke first. They'll make movies about this. Jake smiled. Probably mess it up. Sophie leaned her head against his shoulder. It's okay. Ranger will know the real story. Savannah nodded. Jake looked down at the sleeping dog. He was more than a hero. Sophie finished the sentence for him. He was family. The air on the ranch was different now. Still crisp. Still quiet. but no longer heavy with fear or shadow. The silence, once filled with dread, now carried the soft echoes of healing. Wind rustled the trees gently. Birds returned. The road to the main house was no longer empty. The past hadn't disappeared, but it had been acknowledged. That was enough for those who had survived it. Jake woke up just before sunrise as he always did. Habit, maybe. Muscle memory. He brewed his coffee in the old percolator and poured a second cup for Savannah, who was already out back, tending to the small garden they'd started together. She'd found purpose again. Not in combat or strategy, but in regrowth. Rebirth. She said planting seeds helped her trust the future. Jake believed her. He walked out to the porch and whistled softly. Ranger appeared from the side yard, padding up the steps with his usual calm dignity. His gait had slowed a bit. The limp from the firefight lingered. But his eyes, sharp as ever. Jake crouched and gave him a gentle scratch behind the ears. "Morning, soldier." Ranger leaned into it. Inside, Sophie was stirring. She'd been having good nights lately. No more screaming. No more waking up gasping. Just dreams. And occasionally, she'd talk in her sleep. About her father. About Ranger. About kites and clouds and running with bare feet in the grass. This morning, she stepped into the kitchen wearing her favorite sweatshirt, one Jake had gotten her from a gas station that read Wild and Free. She made toast. No help needed. Progress. Later that day, the town held a dedication ceremony at the newly erected Red River Memorial Grove. Dozens came. Veterans. Reporters. Teachers. Kids with dogs on leashes. Sheriff Dalton, in his pressed uniform, stood beside the governor and read the names of those lost, not just soldiers, but the forgotten, informants, civilians, innocents who vanished into war without a voice. The final name read aloud was one that hadn't appeared in any public records before now. Lieutenant Mark Randall. As the name echoed into the silence, Jake stepped forward with Sophie at his side. She carried the custom plaque, brushed steel, dog tag shaped, and gently hung it beside the American flag. It read, "For service, for memory, for home. Lieutenant Mark Randall and K9 Unit Ranger. Mission complete." Applause rang out. But Ranger didn't move. He stood beside Sophie, unmoving, eyes forward. Still guarding. In the weeks that followed, Sophie began to talk more. Not just to Jake or Savannah, but to people. Neighbors. Children her age. Sometimes she'd talk about the ranch. Sometimes about her father. But most often, about Ranger. "He's not like other dogs," she'd say. "He remembers things no one else does." One day, her teacher asked if she wanted to bring Ranger in for a school visit. She hesitated. Then smiled. "I think he'd like that." On the day of the visit, Ranger wore his medal, tarnished now from wear, and a red bandana that Sophie had tied around his neck. He sat quietly in the classroom, tail gently wagging as the kids gathered around. One little boy asked, "Is he like a superhero?" Sophie nodded. "Kind of. He saved me." Another girl asked, "Did he ever get scared?" Sophie looked at Ranger for a moment. "Maybe. But he never left me. That's what makes him brave." Savannah eventually took an offer to work at a national investigative unit, quiet work, behind the scenes, helping expose other hidden files. She came back to the ranch often. Jake stayed. The ranch became more than home. It became a sanctuary. A place where no more children would be silenced. On the one-year anniversary of the files being released, a documentary premiered. The Dog Who Remembered. It featured clips of Sophie, Jake, Savannah, and yes, Ranger. The final shot showed Sophie walking barefoot through the field with Ranger by her side, wind in her hair, sunlight painting her face gold. Narration by Sophie faded in. My dad told Ranger to protect me. And even when I couldn't speak, he still heard me. He followed me into the dark and never gave up. That's what love is. That's what loyalty is. That's why I'll never forget him. Because he never forgot me. As the screen faded to black, audiences around the world sat in stunned silence. And for once, silence didn't mean fear. It meant respect. Back at the ranch, in the early hours of a spring morning, Sophie woke to find Ranger sitting by the window, staring out into the field. He turned slowly, saw her, and wagged his tail once. She walked to him, wrapped her arms around his neck, and whispered, "For the last time. Good boy."